Welcome back, everyone. We are in Anchorage, Alaska today, and as we are continuing our month focused on education, we are meeting with Ginger Blackman, who is a professor here at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And I'm going to let you talk a little bit about your background and how it is that you got here today.
Well, thank you. I'm originally from San Diego, where I was a teacher for 7.5 years. My bachelor's is actually in physical education with an emphasis in teaching. And I was invited in my first year of teaching to administrative program at the university. So then I was a principal for 13 years in San Diego, out here on the Kenai Peninsula in Seward. I was a high school principal out there, and then a charter school here in Anchorage. I do have experience as a K-12 administrator and I like to say urban, rural, and suburban, because while Kenai's on the road system, it still has, it's isolated kind of in a rural fashion. And I've opened a new school. I've been a principal of a magnet school, a charter school, and a traditional school, to kind of run that whole gamut. And that brought me to the university. I was actually looking to do it for an adjunct position when a full-time tenure track position opened. Not something I thought I wanted to do, but it felt like the description was written for me. So I applied, and here I am 5, almost 6 years later. I do run the Ed Leadership Program, where we train aspiring principals at the university. I've been in charge of that for the last 4 years. And we've been in quite a state of transition over those 4 years, and we're really excited about where we are right now and the work we do with our candidates.
So when you talk about training principals, what are some of the key areas that you look at? A lot of people don't realize that it's actually a very different track than being a classroom teacher.
It is a very different track because it really is grounded in how to be a leader and all that goes along with that. So we look at a variety of things, from the content, what we call developmental courses. What's the theory around the principalship, from culture, engaging teachers in student improvement. How do you build collective efficacy among your staff? How does that translate to student success? What does it mean to be a data literate educator? How do you manage your building? I think that that's been a huge gap in some of our training programs. When we made that shift to a notion of instructional leadership, we forgot that we still had buildings to manage, right? When I took over the program, there was no course in management. It kind of happened in the internship. So that was one of the changes we made, is to say, no, this is an important part of the role. And what does that mean? Particularly looking at things like human resources. When you're looking at school improvement, you're looking at, how do I build capacity in teachers? How do I do my supervision duties? My evaluation is, do I keep them employed? And that's really a management side of the house. So kind of comparing those things. We also do a lot around politics, law, and ethics, because that ethical foundation is so critical. But woven in that are a variety of other things they need to look at. For example, dispositions. What is that social emotional qualities that you need? We look at things like responsibility, we call it responsibility, the 4 R's, reciprocality, resilience, and responsiveness. And then what's embedded in those. We look at the cultural standards for Alaska because a lot of our candidates are in the rural areas, and there's a need to move away from that Western mentality of education, that missionary coming in to save, to how do you really engage with the communities in the way that they've been learning for hundreds and thousands of years to make the education more meaningful. So that cultural responsiveness is really important. Social justice, we look at social justice issues and what does that mean in terms of equity and equality. And then the technology integration is so important around our state. So the ISTE standards are really important. So there's just multiple layers.
Yeah, I'm tired already.
I know, they go on in our program. And at the same time, the profession has come out with a new set of standards, not only for preparation of school leaders, but for in-service. Who should they be and what should they know and be able to do once they're in service? And so we've been engaged in that transition, with this being the first year that we're fully implementing the new standards.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's massive, right? That's asking you to understand infrastructure, understand people, understand data, understand politics, understand culture. That doesn't usually come in one person.
No.
So what goes to my head immediately is we've been talking a lot across the country about this crisis of for our teachers. And some of it is at a very basic level, are they getting paid enough? And the second layer, which is very close to that, is do they have the resources? What that translates to is in 2018 was the first year that it was reported people are not signing up and not willing to pay for their children to go to college to become teachers. When I hear something like this, which sounds mind-boggling, all the different layers and all the different skill sets you need, which are not typically seen in one person, I start thinking, who wants to sign up for this?
Right.
What is the kind of person who is drawn to this kind of a program? Because it's so important. This leadership piece is incredibly important. But I wonder, are you finding some difficulty in attracting and retaining interest as well?
That's an interesting question, because one of the dilemmas that we have right now as a program is recruitment. We have been recruiting by word of mouth, and I will tell you the program has typically been 2 full-time faculty. Now it's just me because of the financial situation, but I do have a couple of adjuncts. Our full-time faculty is now an adjunct doing her specialty courses, and then I have an adjunct who helps me with the interns. But our program has grown since we took over in the last 4 years, from 18 roughly a year to this year we have 30 interns. And that's been word of mouth based on reputation. So now I think we are in that transition with a lot of the political things that are happening, that we have to really go out and say, what are you going to do? Do you want to be a principal? And my dissertation was actually on recruitment of quality candidates into the principalship and the need for formalized mentorships, because we know a lot about selecting the right people, but we don't know how to get the right people to the table.
Yes.
And so I think that's where we're at right now. The people that are drawn to the program are those who have that internal grounding of wanting to do the right thing. For the most part, they want to do the right thing. They want to have a bigger impact. They want to get out there and make a difference. And so they are self-selecting. Every week I'm getting inquiries. And you can't start our program, you have to start it in the summer. You can't start it at any time. So we operate in a cohort model. It's one of the things we push to, is a cohort model so that we can embed more meaningful field experiences in the developmental courses that link to the internship. So once they begin to apply learnings, there's some sense for them about, oh, I remember this, now I'm going to try it out. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, so it doesn't sound like you're having quite the same problem that we're having with some of the teachers getting them recruited.
I don't think right now, for as small as our program is, but I see in the future we will, because there's no denying in the state of Alaska we have a shortage of qualified school administrators. And it's tough to fill positions, particularly in our rural areas. If you're on the road system, it's not hard to find people.
It is so hard for most Americans to understand that point that you just made on the road system. I was in a meeting yesterday and they were talking about the ice melting, and it did not click in my head that what they meant was there was nothing to drive on.
Right.
And so people were getting stranded, and then they were talking about food insecurity. I thought, this is not a problem the rest of the country thinks about and understands, that climate change is causing some of these impacts, and how this trickles down to education of our people, and it just expands from there. One of the things you talked about was all the different types of schooling options, right? Homeschooling and charter schools and magnet schools and private schools and public schools. I think I covered them all. If I didn't add to it, how do you train somebody to be a principal of those different types of spaces? And I'll add one extra layer, because I know you're interested in the homeschooling. You wouldn't necessarily have a principal for homeschooling, but do we ever have like a leadership contact who's helping organize or orchestrate or connect multiple homeschooling families?
That's an interesting question, because you do have principals for homeschools.
Okay.
Because you still got to have a leader who's running the show.
Right.
And we have different kinds of homeschools. in the state, from charter schools to public schools, and some of our homeschools are attached to other systems. For example, in the Kenai district, they have a program called Connections, which is our homeschool program, but it's a district-run program.
Okay.
Where you have another one like IDEA, it's a standalone program, still has a principal. The contact comes in teachers. They still hire certificated teachers in order to monitor what's happening in those homeschool programs, and also to provide support as instructors. So they function in a dual role, and provide professional development for parents who are working with their kids. They kind of coordinate the network, so to speak, and verify that the learning that's happening is actually what's happening.
Very nice, very nice. And then how does that translate out to some of the other types of options for schools?
So tell me your first question again, because
sorry. I was thinking so you have homeschooling, you have charter schools, you have magnet schools, public schools, private schools. I think that's all the different types of schools, isn't it?
Yep.
How do we train differently to oversee those? Yeah.
Yeah, so the requirements is that they're in public schools to do their internships, which is really a struggle for me because there are so many different kinds, and we have more and more people coming to us from the private school realm. And the way we address that is giving the global overview of what leadership is and what are the basics for being a principal. But then in their internship through their school improvement capstone project, how do you individualize that for the context that you're in? And one of the reasons we went to this cohort model was to build a learning community for our students so that they start to build that network that they're going to need when they get into the profession. And so many of the dilemmas are the same, they're just context-based. And so we're able to share that. We'll think about it in this realm. We might have one situation, how does that manifest itself in the private school, or how would it how would it happen in a charter school? Because in a charter school has their own board of directors, in essence their own school board. And so that principal has an added layer of being responsible to their own board plus whatever district. In Alaska, the charter school laws are very narrow. In a lot of ways, charter schools are just alternative programs of a district with their own board of directors. And the board of directors' task, they call them academic policy committees, are to make sure the charter is being followed and to hire and fire the principal.
Oh.
I mean, that's the bottom line. That's really their roles.
Wow.
Wow. So there are a number of charter schools in the Anchorage district, and they all have different focus.
Sure.
One of the things we talk about is school reform, and what are all the reform models out there.
There are so many.
And as I was teaching that this week, I was thinking about, just in Anchorage, all the models that are embedded not only in alternative programs in the district, but in their charter school programs. And how do we know they're working? That was part of our discussion. Yeah, but it is, I like the eclectic group that comes to us from different places because it opens our eyes to what the struggles are. And a lot of the work I've done around the globe has shown me that we all have the same struggles, right? We all struggle with parent involvement. We all struggle with figuring out how to get kids engaged and know whether they're learning. And having good leaders. It's not just unique to the United States.
No. Although we can learn quite a bit from our friends in the Nordic regions.
Yes, we can.
That was definitely one of my findings. Was I was soaking that up. Although I often said to them, "You have 5 million people.
Yeah.
We have hundreds of millions." So it becomes. It's not just doing it to scale.
Right.
It actually adds a significant difference in the culture piece. One of my last questions is, I find it really interesting that you have cultural requirements. That's not typical around the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
There are actually a set of standards that come out of the state, the culturally responsive standards. And I would say that I don't think we use them as well as we could, or we're not as intentional about them. We give a lot of talk to them, and that we need to be more intentional. But it's really critical in our state, as I'm sure it is in states that have native tribes and native villages. It's understanding the context for what we're working, and that has been, I think, the rub in terms of success in our rural districts, is that we're still coming in with somewhat of a Western mentality and expecting that the communities will come to us and embrace us rather than moving in the other direction, particularly when the schools are the center of the community in a lot of villages. How do we change that mentality? Because we still have a large population who went to boarding schools. So there's some apprehension about school and what schooling means based on that experience.
What is it about that experience that affects?
Well, historically, that experience was forced removals, not being able to speak their language, not being able to use their native names, a lot of abuse. And so those, particularly grandparents, take those back and still living. That's their view of what school is, and the people that came in to do schooling. I know my great-grandmother was removed from the reservation in Oklahoma and sent to a boarding school in Indiana. So I kind of get it from a historical perspective because my family experienced it.
And when you say removed, does that mean it was required by the government that they go somewhere else?
For schooling.
And is the reason because there were not schools local?
Part of it was the indoctrination process. We're going to educate you, and we're going to come educate you in our environments. Yeah, it's interesting. Mount Edgecombe was one of the original boarding schools, and I was just there doing their accreditation last year, and that school has really shifted in its purpose, and I was intrigued by families just expecting that when kids got to high school they would go to Mount Edgecombe because of its reputation and what it does. And when you go into one of the rooms, there are pictures on the walls of all the graduating classes, and kids come in and say, there's my granddad, or there's my mom. And so now for that group of people, it's more about the connection to family, which is so important. And so it's a different view of boarding schools, and kids just know when they get to high school, that's where they're going to apply, and they have a waiting list.
But that's a positive.
That's a very positive.
Twist.
Yeah, it's located in Sitka.
Wow.
Yeah, we have a couple of boarding schools.
You refer to Western style education. What would have been the more Native American education system?
So in my mind, it really goes to that mastery learning, which is so embedded in our indigenous cultures. And even historically in our non-indigenous cultures. How did we get by?
Yeah.
Well, it was kind of that apprenticeship.
Sure.
I'm going to teach you how to hunt, how to gather berries, how to make clothes. That's the kind of learning I think that all of our kids need.
Yeah.
But it really has an indigenous grounding when you talk about our rural communities, and coming in and saying, how have you survived? And how does that translate to the kinds of things we need around literacy and mathematics and science? And there's a lot there that we could capitalize on from a problem or project-based mindset.
Completely.
That we don't do in education because we're still in that brick and mortar, non-integrated course sequence, as opposed to, my last school was a competency-based school. So as opposed to, how does this all integrated, and how are you going to demonstrate that you know and understand these things that we expect you to understand? And when you do that, you're moving on to the next one. Excuse me. Whether it's a Tuesday in October or a Thursday in May, you're going to move to that next level, regardless of how old you are, how tall you are, right? And that really supports our students with special needs as well, because we're meeting them where they're at.
Right.
We had a huge success rate for decertifying kids who were identified with special needs, particularly on the autism spectrum, because we put them where they were, gave them the supports from people, and then moved them when they were ready to move. Yeah, and I think as an entire education system, particularly with the resources we have around technology and the access, I don't know why we're not doing that, more of that.
You're speaking my language.
I know.
And I don't mean to plug the book. However, well, it's a free book, so it's not like you make money off it. That is actually exactly I mean, exactly what you just described, what we've put together.
Yeah.
That is entirely where we're trying to go, getting more into narrative, which I know is
Yep.
also a tradition here. Competency-based education is absolutely on the list. Military is going towards that. They're hoping for full operational capability by January 21. So, I mean, it is around the corner. So the infrastructure is being built.
Yeah.
And also looking at different ways to assess that is not the standardized assessment pieces. So part of that project, we're finding new ways to do assessments, which
Right.
could be visually based or video based, looking at a portfolio and finding ways to put the control within the person or the parent. In other words, your teacher might not even be the one that's doing the assessment.
Right.
It may be the case that you're paying some outside entity, and however you learn is
Right.
fine. If you learn resiliency by climbing a mountain or by studying a textbook, we really don't care.
Exactly.
As long as you can demonstrate that you
Right.
have that skill set. And so ultimately, I didn't mean for us to get here, but the whole point of this project I'm doing is national readiness. What you just described is, how do I make sure that you can take care of yourself from a food perspective? How do I make sure you can handle a natural disaster? How do I know that you can handle taking a job? How do I know
Yeah.
that at 25 you are a fully functioning adult? That's our goal.
Yeah.
Not to get you from second to third grade on a timeline.
I know, like an egg carton. But here's the thing in terms of principal preparation.
Yes.
Because that is my mindset. That has been my
Love it.
mindset. So working from that and trying to get adults to understand that they have to own their learning
Right.
through a graduate program is really difficult. Because, I set up things like they do a self-evaluation the first day on a rubric, then midterm at the end, and they get feedback on projects, but they don't get grades. And they struggle, like, well, how do I know I'm getting an A? Well, if you're not mastering, which is a B or above, I'm going to talk to you about that. Otherwise, you're mastering and you're just getting feedback. And I've gotten better at communicating that, so I get less pushback, but it is really difficult. But I want to model for them what I expect when they go out and how they can change things. And even thinking about what students need, as you described, whether you're doing it, climbing a mountain or reading a textbook. Just got an email from a student who's not a principal candidate, working on her master's. This is a course that she felt really would be beneficial for her research study. Just emailed me and said, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm trying to do the project, it's a policy analysis. But I've got this going on in my life, and I've got this and that, and I really don't want to drop because the conversations are so good, I don't know what to do. And I wrote her today and said, don't drop. I have a plan, we'll figure it out. And the reality is what I'm going to do is sit down with her and say, what do you need to know, and how are you going to demonstrate it? It doesn't have to be my projects. I made those up, right? I mean, quite frankly, that's what I think is a good way to demonstrate it, but you're not going to be a principal. So what's going to make sense for you to show me that you've gotten this learning? And we're going to design a plan for her that will be different from what the others are. Because that's just the way I think education should operate. You're the learner. I'm only here to facilitate it. But that's the struggle I think we have right now in our field, our profession is, it doesn't discount who teachers are and what their role is. It shifts it, and for too long, we've been talking about the need to shift that.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest stumbling block we have right now, is that sense of loss that we're not acknowledging and then talking about, so that we can make that change. Ron Heifetz talks about that in his book, Leadership on the Line, right? You've got to acknowledge what you're not going to let go of, and acknowledge that everybody's feeling loss, and what does that mean?
Facilitation.
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much for talking with us
pleasure.
today. This was wonderful. Thank
See, I
you
can get all
for joining
geeked out.
online. Oh, we love it.
I know.
Thank you so much.